Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be a part of this session. I'm Saloni. I am an environmental anthropologist with the Shoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, which is based in India. And what I'm presenting today is part of my PhD work. It seemed relevant in 2019 when I submitted the abstract, and it's been a couple of years since. And I've given this talk so many times I might actually sleep off while talking. Anyway, I'd like to begin by sharing a childhood memory with all of you. So when I was little, my dad would narrate a bedtime story to me every night. And of all the stories he told me growing up, the one I remember most vividly is that of a golden parrot that is captured by a very powerful king. Now, this parrot tries to escape periodically and eventually is successful. And when it does escape, it partakes in exhilarating adventures into unknown, undiscovered lands. And an adventure was narrated to me every few nights until my father fell asleep and I lay in bed visualizing these adventures. The ritual of bedtime stories is obviously not exclusive to me or my family, but it did leave a very strong, indelible imprint on my mind. It triggered my imagination. It aroused a series of emotions in me. And the stories also impacted how I associated uncertainty with adventure and rarely ever with fear or anxiety. Now, stories like these are pervasive across cultures. I'm sure all of you have a story to share. They impact the way we function, what we come to believe in, the kind of biases we sustain, even superstitions. And with this background, I want to dive into the stories that I collected as a PhD student several years ago from the mountains of Ladakh. Ladakh, as some of you might know, especially Ashley and Iftikhar who are working there, is a cold desert where altitudes range from 3,500 meters and upwards. This region, with its steep gorges and endless plains, is where people practice mainly agriculture and animal husbandry. And owing to the way the landscape is, there is not a lot of boundary between people and wildlife, so the boundaries are very fuzzy, which often results in, snow leopards entering a corral and causing surplus killing and then them being killed in retaliation. It's the same picture that you shared, Ashley. Ladakh also has a rich culture of oral storytelling, especially because the winters are really harsh. We're talking about temperatures below minus 30 degree centigrade. So people often have nothing to do in the winters and they gather around the fireplace and exchange stories and wisdom around, around life. And folklore in this region offers very nuanced insights into culture and customs and rituals, including, superstitions. And I kind of learned a lot on this journey where I learned about how people view themselves in relation to wildlife, how people view animals in relation to other animals, be them domestic or wild. And often the ideas or biases that I went in first kind of just melted as I went along in the research. And the stories that I was interested in mainly focused on the snow leopard and the ibex, as well as a wolf. But thankfully, Catherine has made my life easy because she's spoken a lot about stories around the wolf. And also because of the time constraints, I can't go into all the stories, but I have very many. So I'm only for this purpose going to focus on the snow leopard and the ibex. The snow leopard is considered the apex predator in this landscape, and ibex is one of its prey species. And we carried out a combination of archival searches, on-ground interviews with senior folk artists, herders, Tibetan medical practitioners, astrologers, historians, religious heads, monks. And this is kind of to give you a sneak peek. This is a family that I interviewed in Changthang, and kind of give you a sneak peek into some of the stories. Now, when I collected all these stories, I needed a framework to kind of, understand what was the diversity in the narratives, because otherwise it would just be a collection of stories. So I would be honest and say not 100% happy with the framework that I use, but it allows me to kind of show you the diversity of values. So this is something that is adapted from Kellert, Stephen Kellert, who developed this scale where he spoke about the affective dimensions, which deal with emotions, and then the symbolic dimensions, as we all know, utilitarian dimensions, which focus on the utility of the animal to the person or the community, and ecologistic, which focuses on ecological observations and such like. And coming to the ibex, as you can see, most of the narratives around the ibex were utilitarian in nature. The ibex is also a game animal. It used to be hunted in the past and is still hunted in some areas, but not legally. So just to give you an example of a folk song that I collected, which makes a reference to ibex hunting, it goes like this. When an arrow flew to high heaven, it brought back the wings of the bird king. When the arrow flew to the high cliff, it brought down the muscles of the ibex. There's another very famous song called Amadanmo, which describes the final conversation between a mother ibex who's wounded by a hunter and her kid. So the kid asks the mother, "Mother, you look like you have been weeping." And the mother says, "Oh, beloved son, it's nothing more than the water I drank." And the kid persists, "Mother, I see that your waist is blood red." And she says, "It's nothing more than the red mud I rolled in." And then the kid says again, "Mother, I see a man on the pass." "Beloved son, there's only a shepherd on the pass." "Mother, I can see a gun on his shoulder." "Son, that is nothing more than the shepherd's stick." And then she ends by saying, "Son, let 100 big ibex walk in front and 100 big ibex behind you. Strong and mighty boy, never walk ahead. Beloved son of mine, never lag behind." With these last words, she collapses to the ground. The ibex is also frequently associated with positive symbolism. It is considered pure and therefore the deity of the livestock of the deities. Images of ibex hunting are quite prevalent in petroglyphs of the region. Some of these petroglyphs are pre-Buddhist. They are from the Bon religion, and so several hundreds of years old. Because they are considered auspicious, ibex figurines made of dough are often displayed during Losar, which is the Tibetan New Year, and at the time of the birth of a child, especially a male child. Their horns and blood used to be offered to deities to appease to them. This is a traditional structure called the lato, which is where the deity of the village resides. And every year I was told that people offer a pair of ibex horns to the deity to appease it. Coming then to the snow leopard narratives. Most of the narratives around the snow leopard were also utilitarian in nature. For example, snow leopard fur often made for great trophy. Snow leopard organs and bones have been used in Tibetan medicine, and skin in certain rituals. Now, Tibetan healing works via a combination of spiritualism and medicine, and snow leopard parts may be consumed not only for their medical properties, but also because it's believed that the animal's power can be transferred to the person consuming it. Therefore, as you can see, was traditionally used to make shoes, bags, lined jackets for warmth. And this is a painting that we picked up in a monastery in Ladakh that kind of depicts the use of its fur. Many narratives also offered observations about their behavior and ecology. So, for example, the snow leopard is referred to by different names. It's called Jatpo, or the one who stalks, Salapo, or the one who eats grass, and Perka, Nama Perka, which means animal with a stick-like tail. Now, though infrequent, you can see that the snow leopard is also associated with positive symbolism in a few legends, and I will describe just one such legend. The snow leopard was often described as a natural ornament of the mountains. It is sometimes also depicted in the petroglyphs of the region, which are very rare, and most of them have been destroyed because of road construction. And there is this one legend which a lot of people told me about, in which a yogi who was meditating in a cave for several years comes across a famished snow leopard, and out of the goodness of his heart offers some meat to the snow leopard. Now, without realizing that the snow leopard had actually fed the deity that it was meant to worship. And the deity rewarded his kindness by leaving a freshly killed ungulate at the entrance of his cave the next day. So to quickly summarize, we sought to understand the relationship between people and high-altitude animals in folklore. As mentioned earlier, folk stories can enable us to think about and make sense of social structures, moral codes, as well as participate in political discourses about human and non-human worlds. It appears that certain animals are used to illustrate certain qualities more frequently than others. Wild ungulates are globally hunted for sport, but in the case of the ibex in Ladakh, one could say that their utility was not limited to trophies alone, which was anyway illegal at the moment, but also had close links to several economic as well as cultural dimensions. The qualities attributed to the snow leopard represent most predominantly aesthetic and economic dimensions with a mix of ecological observations that highlights its role as a predator in the landscape. Sometimes the key takeaway for me was that sometimes our own biases as conservationists interfere with what people are telling us about the animal. And one of the key learnings was that there was a spectrum of values that people associated with different animals and with the same animal. And I remember this one time when I walked into the landscape, I did this work with the Snow Leopard Trust and the Nature Conservation Foundation. So my primary kind of motivation was conservation of snow leopards. So I went in with this idea that snow leopards are ecological flagships for the landscape and therefore need to be preserved, right? And I go into this landscape and I start asking people stories about the snow leopard. And everybody turns back and says, we don't really have as many stories about the snow leopards as you would think. And that really made me wonder, because I always thought that, hey, it's a predator. There should be plenty of stories about this animal. And then they explained to me that we have more stories about animals that we see in our day-to-day lives. So, crows, choughs, kites, eagles, even ibex, because we use them a lot in our rituals, in our customs. We hunt, we exchange the meat. We used to exchange the meat. And so I realized that for them, the concept, a more applicable concept would be that of a cultural flagship, and often the ecological and the cultural flagship might be two different things altogether. And I think that is something that I came to realize through my journey as a doctoral student. Anyway, so I think it's important to remember that our biases can actually result in certain kinds of associations with animals gaining more salience than other ways of viewing the animal. And so with this, I'd like to end. I have a lot of people to thank, my co-authors, donors, and a lot of people who helped me along the way. And happy to take questions if there are any.
Again, we have time for 2 questions, maybe? Quick ones or one long one? Sure. Is there a mic?
Thank you so much for these wonderful stories. And I'm an ecologist from the Netherlands. We now have 30 to 40 wolves in the country, and we have big problems accepting them. And I was thinking we are working from our Western rational minds in solving the problems. And for me, I think our way to coexistence is through our hearts and through storytelling. And you showed the pictures of people around the fire explaining stories to each other. What would you advise us how we could get coexistence? And even more challenging for me, how could I be part in storytelling this kind of stories? Because so many stories on Brother Wolf, for instance, and still be accepted as an independent scientist in this world.
Thanks. That's a good question, and that is a dilemma I often face too. I think I also have the same biases that you are talking about, because I've been trained in a certain way of doing science, which is very Western in that sense. But so it's been a learning for me too. But I think the one thing that I consciously avoided was to how do you say, to judge and, kind of just listen to people without really making my mind up about anything or having an opinion of my own. Because I think when people feel accepted, they share more. So the idea was, even if I don't agree with it as a conservationist, I mean, they told me so many stories that I can't share because of confidentiality reasons about hunting and trade and so many things. But my idea behind the collection of stories was really to understand how they are perceiving these animals, not so much to do activism or advocacy. That could be something that can be done in a different framework. So I think respecting people's stories, the way they want to tell them, I think is an important first step at least.
We can have maybe one another quick question. Yes, Anne.
Canis, can I help? Yeah, so at some point of time, you said that you're not exactly happy with the framework that you used. So what could be the most satisfactory framework right now, at your hindsight, you can talk about?
I mean, the reason I said it wasn't satisfactory was because it's reductive, and you're bringing in a lot of complexity and trying to quantify it and measure it and, kind of come up with some metric to show diversity and things like that. So in that sense, I was dissatisfied. But with any quantitative framework that you use, that is bound to happen. So I don't really know what is a good framework. If you get to know, please do let me know also.
So is your question a quick one?
Merci beaucoup, je vais parler en français. Oui, je regarde mes interprètes. Oui, je voulais parler de deux choses. Il est vrai que les suspicions peuvent amener à la protection, ce qui est positif, ou créer un mythe autour de la faune. Et deux exemples. Un premier exemple, c'est qu'au parc national de Virunga, je viens de la RDC, au parc national de Virunga, la population, quand ils ont vu les gorilles pour la première fois, ils ont considéré ça comme des esprits. Et jusqu'à présent, la montagne où on avait vu les gorilles pour la première fois, on appelle ça la montagne des esprits. Et ça a créé une protection envers les gorilles des montagnes. Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, la communauté riveraine ne peut pas tuer puis se considérer comme si ce sont des esprits, ce sont leurs ancêtres qui vivent là-bas. Mais aussi, il y a une question bizarre que je voulais poser. On venait de passer une période de Covid et chez moi, il y a eu Ebola, que vous connaissez. Et tout ça, on dit que ça venait des animaux. C'est positif, puisque ça permet aux gens de ne pas manger les singes, les chauves-souris, les pangolins. Mais aussi, c'est négatif, puisqu'on te voit avec ça aussi, il peut avoir déjà la maladie, puisqu'il est à côté de ces animaux. Comment vous jugez ça?
Thank you for your presentation. I have 2 points. First of all, I quite understand that this sort of storytelling and myths, studying of myths, can be very positive for conservation. It's also a way to create a myth. Now, I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I work in the national parks in Virunga, and the first time that local people saw gorillas, they were convinced that they were spirits, and that where the gorillas lived was the land of the spirits. The community felt that those were their ancestors. But strangely, we've just been through COVID, and we've also, you may have heard, in our country, been faced with Ebola. And as a result, people have blamed the animals and for these 2 scourges. That can be seen in a positive light, however, because as a result, people have stopped eating monkeys, pangolins, and bats. So I was interested in your thoughts about the positive impacts of something that might appear negative.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, So here's another learning I had along the way, which was I went into the landscape with the hope of conservation, and it was a very utilitarian approach in the sense that I wanted these stories to be documented so that they could be used for better conservation messaging or more culturally relevant conservation programs. But I realized that one can't use culture in that sense, because it's a much bigger concept. It's not something that can just be, you can take some story from here and apply it elsewhere and it works. So I mean, yeah, all kinds of stories have positive and negative impacts on people and wildlife. So if you start cherry picking, I don't know, it's an ethical dilemma for me, because if once you start cherry picking and you pick stories that go with your narrative, what happens to the rest? Or vice versa, So I don't know how I feel about, using it as it is and just applying it in a particular scenario. So yeah, but thank you.
Thank you, Saloni.